The Last Twilight. Naruto candles burned low in the White House on that spring evening of 1865, their amber light dancing across maps scarred with the marks of 4 years of war. Abraham Lincoln stood at the window of his office, gazing out at a capital that had survived, a union that had endured, though at a cost almost too terrible to comprehend. The lines etched deep into his face told their own story, each crease a testament to the 600,000 souls whose deaths he had borne upon his shoulders. His hands, those large, weathered hands that had once split rails on an Illinois frontier, now trembled slightly as they held a letter from a mother who had lost all 5 of her sons to the cause. Beyond the window, Washington celebrated. The war was ending. Robert E. Lee had surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia just days before at APPOMATTOX courthouse, and the great rebellion that had threatened to destroy the American experiment appeared finally, mercifully, to be drawing to its conclusion. Church bells rang across the city, their jubilant peals carrying on the warm April breeze. Citizens danced in the streets, soldiers embraced, and the long shadow of war seemed at last to be lifting. Joy. Standing there in that moment, he appeared more like a man surveying ruins than one celebrating victory. Perhaps it was exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that comes from carrying the weight of a nation through its darkest hour. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the hard work of healing and reconstruction lay ahead, a task that might prove even more challenging than the war itself. Or perhaps, though he could not have known it then, it was something else. Some premonition that whispered through the quiet spaces of his mind, telling him that his work was nearly done, that he would not live to see the fruits of all this suffering and sacrifice. He had aged decades in 4 years. Photographs from before the war showed a vigorous man of 51, lean and strong despite his unusual height. Now, at 56, he looked ancient. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken and haunted by visions of battlefields he had never visited, but whose carnage he knew intimately from the reports that crossed his desk each morning. The grey in his hair had deepened to white in places, and his movements carried the weight of a man who had walked through fire and emerged forever changed. Obviously, the celebration continued, building in intensity as night fell. But inside that office, Lincoln remained still, lost in thoughts that none would ever fully know. He thought of the boys in blue and grey who would never come home, of the mothers and fathers, wives and children who would live with empty chairs at their tables for the rest of their days. He thought of the 4 million souls still emerging from the nightmare of bondage, their freedom purchased with blood, but their future still uncertain, still fragile. And he thought, perhaps, of the long journey that brought him from a dirt-floor cabin in the Kentucky wilderness to this moment, this place, this terrible and magnificent responsibility. The story of Abraham Lincoln is not simply the story of a man who rose from poverty to power, though it is that. It is not merely the tale of a president who saved the Union, though he did that too. It is the story of a nation's soul being tested in the crucible of war, of principles being forged in the fire of conflict, of a democracy learning whether it could endure when its very foundations were shaken to dust. And at the center of that story stands this improbable figure, this rail-splitter turned statesman, this melancholy man who would become the martyr prophet of American democracy. But to understand how Lincoln came to stand at that window on that April evening, to grasp the full measure of what he had endured and what he had achieved, we must journey backward, back through the years of war and politics, back through the modest triumphs of his legal career and the early disappointments of his political life, all the way back to a place as far removed from the corridors of power as could be imagined. We must go back to a log cabin in the woods of Kentucky, where on a bitter February morning in 1809, a child was born into poverty so profound that his survival itself would be a kind of miracle. From the Wilderness, a Homer. Abraham Lincoln entered the world on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin on Sinking Spring Farm in Hardin County, Kentucky. The structure that sheltered his birth was barely more than a hut, with a dirt floor, a single window, and walls chinked with mud to keep out the winter wind. His father Thomas was a farmer and carpenter who struggled constantly with land title disputes that would eventually drive the family from Kentucky altogether. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was a gentle, pious woman from whom, Lincoln would later say, he inherited his tenderness and his way with words, though he spoke of her rarely in his later years. The Kentucky frontier in 1809 was a little a future from his revolution of long ways with some of Lincoln. The first attempts of right world, the bottom and willed in the future that was made by free murd with serves of Lincoln. The girls works to the truth, the Kentucky farmer was little disclose the disness from his laves. The changesley, the Kentucky was known as health and bricked and it links, the first word self, but he limited anything. The Kentucky farmer in 1809 was a furtive brief now in 1809 was a future with himlands of Lincoln. The later places of Fommer and a turned a simply long ways with free from his land. The Fommer from his Hanks, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was truling his wild was possible with Russia. The moment of self, we consider that police served was moved to this platform. The Kentucky present was making a soper weight of them to play, and now, the free from the creditor they would be a good, and further thing, was staled with 1809, was a hard land that bred hard people. Survival demanded constant labor, and childhood was brief for those lucky enough to survive it at all. When Abraham was 2 years old, the family moved to a slightly larger farm at Knob Creek, where his earliest memories would form. He would recall watching the flash floods that sometimes tore through the valley, washing away the corn and pumpkin seeds he had helped his father plant. He remembered the feel of the rich Kentucky soil between his fingers and the exhausting work of clearing stumps and splitting rails under the unforgiving sun. Even in those early years, something set the boy apart. While other children seemed content with the narrow horizons of frontier life, Abraham was consumed by curiosity. He asked questions that made the adults uncomfortable, questions about why things were the way they were, questions that suggested a mind unwilling to accept the world as given. When he learned that slaves were sometimes marched past his family's farm on the Louisville-Nashville Turnpike, their hands bound, their eyes hollow with despair, something took root in his heart, a seed of moral revulsion that would grow throughout his life. In December 1816, when Abraham was 7 years old, the family made the difficult journey to Indiana. Thomas Lincoln had grown frustrated with the land title problems that plagued Kentucky landowners, and he was drawn by the promise of clearer legal titles in Indiana Territory, which was preparing for statehood. There was another factor, too, one that Thomas never spoke of directly, but that shaped his decision nonetheless. Kentucky was a slave state, and Thomas Lincoln, influenced by the separate Baptist tradition that condemned slavery, wanted his family to live in free territory. The move to Indiana marked the beginning of the hardest years of Abraham's childhood. The family settled on unbroken forest land in what would become Spencer County, and the work of carving a homestead from the wilderness was brutal. They lived at first in a half-faced camp, a crude, three-sided structure open to the elements on one side, with only a roaring fire to keep them warm through the winter nights. Abraham, though just a boy, was pressed into service alongside his father, wielding an axe to clear trees, helping to build the permanent cabin that would become their home, working from dawn until after dark in an endless cycle of labor. Then October 1818, tragedy struck with devastating force. Nancy Hanks Lincoln fell ill with milk sickness, a mysterious ailment caused by drinking milk from cows that had grazed on white snake root. There was no cure, no treatment, no hope. Abraham, just 9 years old, watched his mother waste away over the course of a few terrible days. On October 5th, she died, leaving him, his 12-year-old sister Sarah, and their father alone in that cabin in the wilderness. The year that followed Nancy's death was perhaps the bleakest of Abraham's life. His father, devastated by grief and ill-equipped to manage a household, left the children largely to fend for themselves. The cabin had no proper floor, and during that winter, the family huddled together for warmth, struggling to survive on what little they could hunt and forage. Abraham later described those months in stark terms, a time of darkness and deprivation that might have broken a lesser spirit. But then, in December 1819, something remarkable happened. Thomas Lincoln traveled back to Kentucky and returned with a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. Sarah brought with her not just her own family, but something the cabin had desperately needed: warmth, organization, and hope. More than that, she brought books. She recognized something special in young Abraham, something that set him apart from the other children, and she encouraged his hunger for learning in a way no one had before. Abraham came to love his stepmother deeply, calling her his angel mother, and maintaining a bond with her that would last his entire life. She saw in him a brightness, an intelligence that was being wasted in the endless drudgery of farm labor. While she could not exempt him from the work that was expected of every frontier boy, she made sure he had time to read, and she defended his bookish tendencies against Thomas's belief that education was a waste of time for a farmer's son. The formal education Abraham received was pitifully inadequate by any standard. He attended what were called ABC schools, or blab schools, where students repeated their lessons aloud in a kind of cacophony that was thought to aid memory. His schooling came in brief spurts, a few weeks here, a few months there, whenever a traveling teacher passed through the area and whenever farm work permitted. In total, Lincoln estimated, his formal education amounted to less than 1 year. But what he lacked in formal instruction, he made up for with a fierce determination to educate himself. He read everything he could get his hands on, which, in that place and time, was not much. The family Bible, of course, and Pilgrim's Progress, and later Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, and a history of the United States. He walked miles to borrow books from neighbors, and he would read by the light of the fireplace late into the night, lying on his stomach on the dirt floor, his face so close to the pages that his eyes ached. When he had finished a book, he would read it again, and then again, until he had memorized long passages. He discovered that he had a gift for language, for the rhythm and music of words. He loved poetry, and would recite verses as he worked in the fields, the words keeping time with the swing of his axe. He taught himself grammar from a borrowed textbook, and he practiced writing by making marks in the dirt with sticks when paper was too precious to waste. His stepmother later recalled finding him everywhere with a book, always reading, always learning, always reaching for something beyond the narrow confines of the frontier. Prohibited. In January 1828, another tragedy struck when Sarah, Abraham's beloved sister, died in childbirth at the age of 20. The loss devastated him. She had been his companion through all the hardships of their childhood, and her death left a wound that never fully healed. Years later, he would write a poem about returning to his childhood home, and the melancholy that suffused those verses spoke to the depth of his grief for the sister and the mother he had lost in that hard land. By the time Abraham reached his early 20s, he had grown into a man unlike any his neighbors had seen. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, towering over almost everyone around him, with a lanky, awkward frame that made him appear all arms and legs. He was enormously strong from years of hard labor, capable of splitting rails with a speed and precision that amazed those who worked alongside him. But it was his mind that truly set him apart. He had a way with words, a talent for storytelling and humor that made him popular at social gatherings, and an intelligence that was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone who knew him. In 1830, when Abraham was 21 years old, the family made one final move, this time to Illinois near Decatur. He helped his father build yet another cabin and clear yet another patch of wilderness for farming. But as he worked, he knew that this would be his last service to his father. He had spent his entire youth laboring for Thomas Lincoln's benefit, as was the custom of the time, but now he was ready to strike out on his own, to leave behind the life of endless toil and limited horizons that his father had chosen. 1831, after helping to take a flatboat loaded with produce down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, Abraham Lincoln settled in the village of New Salem, Illinois. He was 22 years old, with barely a year's worth of formal education, no money, no connections, and no clear plan for his future. What he did have was intelligence, ambition, and a determination to make something of himself that burned with an intensity his neighbors could scarcely comprehend. The boy from the dirt floor cabin was about to begin his transformation into something the frontier had rarely produced: a self-made scholar, a lawyer, and eventually a politician who would change the course of human history. The self-made scholar. Psychologists, New Salem, Illinois, in 1831, was hardly more than a hamlet, a collection of rough cabins and stores perched on a bluff overlooking the Sangamon River. It was a place where a man could make a fresh start, where his origins mattered less than his character and his willingness to work. Abraham Lincoln arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back and a hunger to prove himself that would define the next crucial years of his life. Job in New Salem was as a clerk in a general store owned by Denton Offutt, who had hired him to help navigate the flatboat down to New Orleans. Offutt was impressed by the young man's honesty and his way with people, and he gave Lincoln responsibility beyond what his age and experience might have warranted. Lincoln took to the work with characteristic diligence, earning a reputation for fairness and integrity that would serve him well. Stories spread through the village of the clerk who would walk miles to return a few pennies he had accidentally overcharged a customer, or who stayed up late to make sure the books balanced perfectly. They began calling him Honest Abe, a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. But clerking in a store, however honestly done, was not enough to satisfy Lincoln's ambitions. He saw in New Salem an opportunity to continue his education, and he seized it with both hands. He joined the local debating society, where he discovered that his natural gift for storytelling and his growing command of language could be put to use in intellectual combat. He stumbled at first, his backwards accent and awkward manner drawing snickers from some of the more educated members. But Lincoln had never been one to let failure define him. He practiced his speaking, consciously worked to refine his arguments, and gradually transformed himself into one of the most effective debaters in the county. He read voraciously, borrowing every book he could find in the village. When he learned that a farmer several miles away owned a copy of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, he walked there to borrow it, then spent his evenings studying it by candlelight, teaching himself the fundamental principles of law. He devoured newspapers, memorized poetry, and studied grammar with an intensity that puzzled his neighbors. Why, they wondered, did this young man work so hard to educate himself when he could make a decent living with his hands? In 1832, at 53, Lincoln made his first foray into politics, running for a seat in the Illinois state legislature. It was an audacious move for someone so young and so lacking in credentials, but Lincoln had never been intimidated by his humble origins. He issued a brief campaign statement in which he advocated for improvements to river navigation and education, and he set out to meet the voters personally, traveling throughout the district, speaking at every opportunity, and using his natural storytelling ability to win support. The campaign was interrupted by "And the member of guns makes longst to those search, and lost to think that was creating than the medical company." The campaign was interrupted by "In the best rain." The campaign was Morton Stutley flipped and support. The campaign was review of the Kignan of Shift Up. The campaign was looking for the rose of a lord way that they would win the mitter. A sility was well extremely to sleeped and allowed, and the rose of a lord was completely flet. The campaign was interrupted by an event that would provide Lincoln with one of his few military experiences. In April 1832, the Black Hawk War broke out when Sac and Fox Indians, led by the warrior Black Hawk, crossed back into Illinois from Iowa in defiance of a treaty that had forced them from their homeland. Lincoln volunteered for the militia and was elected captain of his company by his fellow volunteers, a sign of the respect he had already earned in his community. It was, he would later joke, the only election he ever won by an outright majority. Lincoln's service in the Black Hawk War was brief and uneventful. His company saw no combat, and his most memorable moment came when he stopped his own men from executing an elderly Native American who had stumbled into their camp. The old man carried a letter of safe passage from American authorities, but the volunteers, their blood up and eager for violence, wanted to kill him anyway. Lincoln stepped between his men and their intended victim, his tall frame suddenly commanding, his voice cutting through the mob's fury. He challenged any man who wanted to harm the old Native American to fight him first. His men backed down. It was an early demonstration of Lincoln's moral courage, his willingness to stand alone against popular passion when he believed he was right. After the war ended, Lincoln returned to New Salem and resumed his campaign for the legislature, but he had lost precious time. When the votes were counted, he finished 8th out of 13 candidates. It was a defeat, but not a crushing one, and Lincoln took heart from the fact that in his home precinct of New Salem, where people knew him best, he had won by an overwhelming margin. He resolved to try again. In the meantime, he needed to make a living. He went into partnership with William Berry to operate a general store, obtaining a license to sell liquor and transforming the establishment into something of a tavern. But Berry proved to be an alcoholic who was often unable to work, and despite decent business, the enterprise fell deeply into debt. When Berry died in 1835, Lincoln found himself responsible for what he called the national debt, a sum of roughly $1,100, an enormous amount of money for a poor man in those days. It took him years to pay it off, but he did so eventually, dollar by hard-earned dollar, cementing his reputation for honesty even as it kept him in grinding poverty. During New Salem, Lincoln fell in love for what may have been the first time. Her name was Anne Rutledge, the daughter of a local tavern keeper, and by most accounts she was intelligent, attractive, and kind. The historical record of their relationship is frustratingly sparse and contested. Some sources suggest they were engaged, others that they were merely friends. What is certain is that when Anne died suddenly of typhoid fever in August 1835, at the age of 22, Lincoln was devastated. Friends recalled him sinking into a depression so profound that they feared for his sanity. He wandered the woods around New Salem, talking to himself, contemplating suicide, unable to accept the loss of yet another person he had loved. But resilience that was almost superhuman. He emerged from his grief, changed, perhaps, but determined to continue his pursuit of something greater than the life he had known. He threw himself into study with renewed intensity. In 1834, he ran again for the state legislature, and this time, with better preparation and a more established reputation, he won. At 25 years old, Abraham Lincoln was finally an elected official, ready to begin his political career in earnest. Yet even as he prepared to take his seat in the legislature, Lincoln recognized that he needed more than political success. He needed a profession that would command respect and provide a steady income. He decided to become a lawyer. The decision was logical enough. The practice of law offered a path to prosperity and influence for those willing to work hard, and Lincoln was nothing if not willing to work. But he had no formal education beyond his year of scattered schooling, no connections, and no money to pay for any kind of legal training. So Abraham Lincoln did what he had always done. He taught himself. He borrowed law books from John Todd Stewart, an attorney in Springfield who had encouraged him during the Black Hawk War and who saw potential in the tall, awkward young man from New Salem. Lincoln carried those books with him everywhere, studying during breaks in legislative sessions, reading late into the night, making careful notes in his spare moments. He approached the study of law with the same methodical intensity he had brought to grammar and rhetoric. He memorized cases, analyzed precedents, and worked through complex legal arguments until he understood them thoroughly. In 1836, Lincoln passed the bar examination and received his license to practice law. He was 27 years old, entirely self-taught, and about to embark on a legal career that would eventually make him one of the most successful attorneys in Illinois. But more than that, his years of self-education had transformed him from a frontier laborer into an intellectual, a man who could hold his own in debate with the most educated lawyers and politicians in the state. The boy who had learned to read by firelight on a dirt floor had become a scholar, and that scholar was ready to take on the world. Springfield and the arena. In 1837, Abraham Lincoln moved to Springfield, the new capital of Illinois, to begin his law practice in partnership with John Todd Stewart. Springfield was a far cry from the frontier villages Lincoln had known. With a population of around 1,500, it was a real town, with brick buildings, several churches, a courthouse, and a growing commercial district. It was a place where ambition could find room to breathe, where a man of ability could make his mark. Lincoln arrived with all his possessions in 2 saddlebags, riding a borrowed horse, still deeply in debt from the failed store venture, but determined to succeed. The practice of law in Illinois during the 1830s and 1840s was a peripatetic affair. Lawyers traveled from county to county, following the circuit court judges, staying in taverns and boarding houses, trying cases before juries of farmers and merchants, and then moving on to the next town. It was a grueling life, but Lincoln thrived in it. He discovered that his frontier upbringing, which had once seemed like such a liability, was actually an asset. He could connect with juries in a way that more polished, educated lawyers could not. He spoke their language, understood their concerns, and could make complex legal arguments accessible to ordinary people. Lincoln developed a reputation for thorough preparation and devastating logic. He had an almost uncanny ability to identify the central issue in any case and to frame his arguments around that issue with absolute clarity. He was not a dramatic orator in the courtroom. His voice was high and somewhat unpleasant to the ear. But when he rose to speak, people listened, because they knew he would tell them the truth as he saw it, without embellishment or manipulation. His honesty became his greatest weapon. Juries trusted him, and that trust translated into victories. The circuit life also suited Lincoln's temperament. He was sociable, despite his periodic melancholy, a gifted storyteller who could hold a room spellbound with his tales and jokes. In the evenings, when the day's legal work was done, lawyers and judges would gather in hotel rooms or taverns, and Lincoln would be at the center of the group, spinning yarns and engaging in the kind of intellectual sparring that he loved. He made friends easily among his fellow attorneys, and many of those friendships would last a lifetime. William Herndon, who would become his law partner and later his biographer, remembered Lincoln as the most memorable man he had ever met, a person of seeming contradictions who combined frontier roughness with genuine intellectual depth. In Springfield, Lincoln also entered into what would become the most complicated relationship of his life. At a social gathering in 1839, he met Mary Todd, the daughter of a wealthy and prominent family from Lexington, Kentucky. Mary was intelligent, well-educated, and socially accomplished, everything that Lincoln felt himself not to be. She was also temperamental, ambitious for her husband's success, and prone to dramatic emotional swings. The attraction between them was immediate, but troubled from the start. He became engaged in 1840, but Lincoln broke off the engagement on January 1, 1841, a day he would later refer to as the most miserable of his life. His reasons for this decision remain a subject of historical debate. Perhaps he doubted his ability to provide for Mary in the style to which she was accustomed. Perhaps he was simply terrified of marriage and the responsibilities it would bring. Whatever the reason, the broken engagement sent Lincoln into another profound depression. Friends found him talking of suicide, unable to work, his mind paralyzed by doubt and despair. But Mary Todd was not willing to give up so easily. Over the next year and a half, the two were reconciled, and on November 4, 1842, they were married in a small ceremony at Mary's sister's house in Springfield. The marriage that followed was turbulent. Mary's temper and Lincoln's melancholy made for a volatile combination. She berated him for his absent-mindedness and his lack of social polish. He withdrew into himself, spending long hours at his law office to escape the tension at home. Yet there was also genuine affection between them. Mary believed passionately in Lincoln's potential for greatness, and her ambition for him never wavered. Lincoln, for his part, was devoted to their 4 sons and worked tirelessly to provide for his family, despite the strains in the marriage. Their first son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was born in 1843 and would be the only one of their children to survive to adulthood. Edward Baker Lincoln followed in 1846, but died in 1850 at the age of 3, a loss that devastated both parents. William Wallace Lincoln was born in 1850, and Thomas "Tad" Lincoln arrived in 1853. The children brought joy and chaos to the Lincoln household in equal measure, and Lincoln proved to be an indulgent, playful father who delighted in his sons, even as he struggled to maintain order in his domestic life. While building his law practice and his family, Lincoln continued his political career. He served 4 consecutive terms in the Illinois state legislature from 1834 to 1842, representing the Whig Party and generally supporting internal improvements like roads, canals, and railroads, as well as a state banking system. He was an effective legislator, skilled at building coalitions and finding common ground, though he sometimes took positions that put him at odds with popular opinion. In 1837, Lincoln joined with just 5 other legislators out of 83 to oppose a resolution condemning abolitionists. It was a courageous stand in a state where anti-abolitionist sentiment ran high, and it demonstrated that Lincoln's moral opposition to slavery was deepening, even as he remained uncertain about the practical steps that should be taken toward emancipation. The following year, when abolitionist newspaper editor Elijah Lovejoy was killed by a pro-slavery mob in Alton, Illinois, Lincoln spoke out against the violence, warning that mob rule threatened the very foundations of Republican government. Lincoln achieved what was then his greatest political triumph. He won election to the United States House of Representatives, becoming Illinois' representative in the 30th Congress. It was a remarkable achievement for the self-taught lawyer from New Salem, and when he traveled to Washington in 1847 to take his seat, he must have reflected on the long journey that had brought him from a Kentucky log cabin to the halls of national power. His time in Congress, however, proved disappointing. He served only 1 term, from 1847 to 1849, and he made little impact on the national stage. His most controversial action came when he introduced the Spot resolutions, challenging President James K. Polk to identify the exact spot where American blood had been shed on American soil to justify the Mexican War. Lincoln believed the war was unjust, an act of aggressive expansion disguised as self-defense, and he was not afraid to say so. But his opposition to a war that many of his constituents supported proved politically damaging. When his term ended, he chose not to seek re-election, returning instead to Springfield and his law practice. The next 5 years, from 1849 to 1854, Lincoln largely withdrew from politics, focusing on building his legal reputation and earning the money his growing family needed. He became one of the most successful lawyers in Illinois, handling cases before the state Supreme Court and earning fees that finally allowed him to live comfortably. He bought a house in Springfield, the only home he would ever own, and settled into what seemed like a permanent domestic and professional routine. But even as Lincoln practiced law and raised his family, events were unfolding on the national stage that would draw him back into politics and set him on the path to the presidency. The question of slavery's expansion into the Western territories, which had been temporarily resolved by the Compromise of 1850, was about to explode again with a force that would shake the nation to its foundations. And when it did, Abraham Lincoln would find that he could no longer remain on the sidelines. The cause he had been preparing for all his life, though he did not know it yet, was about to call him back to the arena. The Moral Awakening. In May 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and with it shattered the uneasy peace that had prevailed over the slavery question for nearly 4 years. The act, championed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had prohibited slavery in the Louisiana Purchase Territory north of the 36 degrees 30 feet parallel. In place of that clear prohibition, Douglas proposed the doctrine of popular sovereignty, allowing settlers in each new territory to vote on whether to permit slavery. It was, Douglas argued, democratic, giving the people themselves the power to decide their own institutions. To Abraham Lincoln and many others in the North, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was not democracy, but a moral catastrophe. It meant that slavery, that institution which Lincoln had always believed to be wrong, could now spread anywhere, could plant its roots in soil that had been forever free. More than that, it meant that the founding principle of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, was being abandoned in favor of political expediency. Lincoln was shocked, angered, and, for the first time in years, compelled to speak out. In the fall of 1854, Lincoln returned to the political arena with a vengeance. He delivered speeches throughout central Illinois, attacking the Kansas-Nebraska Act with a moral fervor that surprised even those who knew him well. At Peoria on October 16th, he gave what would become known as the Peoria Speech, a 3-hour address in which he laid out his opposition to slavery with unprecedented clarity and force. He did not argue for immediate abolition. He recognized the constitutional protections that slavery enjoyed in the states where it already existed, and he acknowledged the practical difficulties of emancipation. But he insisted, with passionate conviction, that slavery was a moral wrong that should be placed on the path to ultimate extinction. Lincoln articulated a position that would define his politics for the rest of his life. Slavery, he argued, was fundamentally incompatible with American principles. It violated the self-evident truth that all men are created equal. It denied to millions of human beings the fruits of their own labor, the right to rise based on their own merit, the basic human dignity that should belong to every person. To allow slavery to spread into new territories was to declare that these principles did not matter, that power and profit could trump justice and morality. Marginalized. Yet Lincoln was no radical abolitionist. He did not believe in immediate emancipation, which he thought would lead to social chaos. He did not advocate for racial equality in the modern sense. The prejudices of his time and place limited his vision of what freedom for Black Americans should mean. But what set Lincoln apart was his insistence that slavery was wrong, morally and absolutely wrong, at a time when many politicians sought to avoid moral arguments altogether, treating slavery as merely a political or economic question subject to compromise. The Kansas-Nebraska Act did more than anger Lincoln. It destroyed the Whig Party, which split between northern and southern wings and effectively ceased to exist as a national force. In its place arose a new party, the Republican Party, founded in 1854 on the principle of preventing slavery's expansion. Lincoln watched the party's formation with interest, and in 1856 he formally joined, becoming one of the leading Republicans in Illinois. That same year, at the first Republican National Convention in Philadelphia, Lincoln received 110 votes for the vice presidential nomination, a remarkable show of support for someone who was still relatively unknown on the national stage. Though he did not win the nomination, the votes demonstrated that Lincoln was becoming a figure of importance beyond Illinois. He spent the 1856 campaign speaking on behalf of the Republican presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, who lost to Democrat James Buchanan but made a strong showing in the North. The following years only deepened Lincoln's commitment to the anti-slavery cause. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Dred Scott v. Sandford, ruling that black people, whether enslaved or free, could not be citizens of the United States, and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. The decision was a bombshell, striking down the very position that Lincoln and the Republicans had been advocating. If the court's logic was accepted, then slavery could not be restricted at all, and the promise of free soil would be dead. Lincoln responded to the Dred Scott free, was also playing the Great of the Lincoln course, that is waved to refreated that Lincoln said with anyone. Lincoln wort was truling the place from the dread, and if invite free soil could not consider within decision of the course. Lincoln more than 3/4 by Lincoln stutlished, and the cressival of the slavery would scribed in the Dred Scott. Lincoln responded to the Dred Scott of the Lincoln, the course providing in original way that Lincoln forlot to stead and the probably could not be citizened at alls. Lincoln from there, picking the Dred Scott decision with barely controlled fury. In speeches throughout 1857 and into 1858, he attacked the decision as a perversion of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. He argued that the founders had believed slavery was wrong and had expected it to eventually die out, and that the Dred Scott decision represented a radical departure from their vision. He warned that the forces supporting slavery were engaged in a conspiracy to make it permanent and universal, to create an America where the ideals of human equality were abandoned altogether. It was against this backdrop that Lincoln emerged as the Republican candidate to challenge Stephen Douglas for his Senate seat in 1858. The stage was set for a confrontation that would capture the attention of the entire nation, a series of debates that would define the terms of America's struggle over slavery and would launch Abraham Lincoln toward a destiny he could scarcely have imagined. The debates that shook America. On June 16, 1858, in Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln accepted the Republican Party's nomination for the United States Senate with a speech that would resonate through American history. His voice, that high-pitched, penetrating voice that could carry across vast outdoor crowds, rose to fill the hall as he spoke words that had been carefully chosen, painstakingly crafted, to capture the crisis facing the nation. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," Lincoln declared, drawing on the Gospel of Mark to frame the slavery question in stark, uncompromising terms. "I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." The House divided speech was a bold, even reckless political gambit. Many of Lincoln's advisers had counseled caution, worried that such inflammatory language would alienate moderate voters. But Lincoln understood that the time for hedging had passed. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision had made it clear that slavery's defenders were not content to leave it where it was. They were pushing for its expansion, for its acceptance as a positive good rather than a necessary evil. If they succeeded, then the entire nation would eventually become a slave nation. The only way to prevent that outcome was to speak the truth plainly, to acknowledge that America faced a fundamental choice about what kind of country it would be. Douglas, the Democrat Lincoln would face, was one of the most powerful politicians in America. Known as the Little Giant for his short stature and oversized influence, Douglas had been in the Senate since 1847 and was widely expected to seek the presidency. He was a masterful debater, a charismatic speaker, and the architect of popular sovereignty, the doctrine that had opened the territories to slavery. For Douglas, slavery was not a moral question, but a matter of local self-government. Let the people of each territory decide for themselves, he argued, and the problem would resolve itself. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of debates, and Douglas, confident in his abilities and aware that refusing would look cowardly, agreed. They would meet 7 times, in 7 different congressional districts across Illinois, between August and October of 1858. The debates would be 3 hours long, following a set format. One candidate would speak for an hour, the other would respond for an hour and a half, and the first would then have a half-hour rebuttal. The candidates would alternate going first. These debates were not modern media events with sound bites and stage-managed confrontations, marathons of argumentation that required the speakers to develop their positions in depth and to respond directly to their opponents' arguments. Thousands of people attended each debate, traveling by wagon, train, and on foot to hear Lincoln and Douglas grapple with the most important question of their age. Newspapers from across the country sent reporters to transcribe the speeches, and the debates became a national sensation. The very first debate in Ottawa on August 21st, the contrast between the 2 men was striking. Douglas was polished, well-dressed, and confident. He attacked Lincoln as a dangerous radical who wanted to impose racial equality and abolish slavery everywhere, consequences that would destroy the Union and provoke war. He accused Lincoln of inconsistency, of saying one thing in the north of Illinois, where anti-slavery sentiment was strong, and another in the South, where support for slavery's expansion had more adherents. Lincoln, by contrast, was awkward in his movements, his voice sometimes cracking, his long limbs seeming to get in his way. But when he spoke, the awkwardness fell away, and what remained was pure moral and logical force. He denied Douglas's accusations, insisting that he had always been consistent. He did not advocate for racial equality in the social sense, he admitted, acknowledging the prejudices of his time. But he insisted that black people had the same natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as white people, the same right to eat the bread earned by their own hands without having it taken from them by others. At Freeport on August 27th, Lincoln posed the question that would define the rest of the campaign. How, he asked Douglas, could popular sovereignty be reconciled with the Dred Scott decision, which held that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories? If settlers could not exclude slavery before statehood, as the Supreme Court had ruled, then how could popular sovereignty mean anything? Douglas's response, which became known as the Freeport Doctrine, was politically clever, but ultimately fatal to his presidential ambitions. The people of a territory, Douglas argued, could effectively exclude slavery simply by refusing to pass the local police regulations and slave codes necessary to protect slaveholders' property. Without such protections, slavery could not survive, regardless of what the Supreme Court said. It was a practical answer, but it enraged Southern Democrats, who had expected Douglas to support their position that slavery must be protected everywhere. The Freeport Doctrine would split the Democratic Party and help ensure Douglas's defeat when he ran for president in 1860. As the debates continued through the blazing heat of summer and into the cooler days of autumn, Lincoln hammered away at his central themes. Slavery was wrong. The Declaration of Independence meant what it said, that all men are created equal. Popular sovereignty was a sham, a way of avoiding moral responsibility by pretending that each territory could decide for itself whether to commit a moral wrong. The Dred Scott decision was a perversion of justice that must be overturned by future Supreme Court appointments. And the slave power, the alliance of Southern slaveholders and Northern sympathizers, was engaged in a conspiracy to make slavery national and permanent. Douglas, for his part, defended popular sovereignty as the only democratic solution to an insoluble problem. He portrayed Lincoln as a radical who would destroy the Union in pursuit of an abstract principle. He appealed to racial prejudice, warning that Lincoln's position would lead to racial mixing and social chaos. He accused Lincoln of advocating uniformity where Douglas believed diversity was strength, each state and territory deciding its own fate. But for all Douglas's political skill, Lincoln was winning the moral argument. He was forcing the nation to confront what it had been trying to avoid, that slavery was not just a political or economic question, but a profound moral evil that could not be compromised away. He was articulating a vision of America grounded in the Declaration of Independence, an America where human equality was not just a beautiful phrase, but a principle that must shape policy and law. When the votes were counted in November 1858, the results were complex. Republicans won the popular vote statewide, 53% to 47%. But because of how the legislative districts were drawn, Democrats won more seats in the Illinois General Assembly, which would choose the senator. Douglas was returned to the Senate by a vote of 54 to 46. Lincoln had lost. Yet in losing, Lincoln had won something far more valuable than a Senate seat. He had become a national figure. The debates had been published in book form and were being read across the North. Republicans saw in Lincoln a champion who could articulate their principles with moral clarity and political shrewdness. His name was being mentioned in discussions of potential presidential candidates. The debates had shown that he could hold his own against one of the nation's most formidable politicians, and more than that, they had revealed him as a man of principle who was willing to speak uncomfortable truths when the moment demanded it. In the 2 years that followed, the surrounding the 21st words with the death gold and Nothan left. In the 2 years that for ability that he was served, as a riving grope to telephine, the debates is a fumal mitter that the belt would support before them down. In the 2 years that stel, the debates had seemed the model places with again. In the 2 years that followed, the to created nation particularly along 2 years that followed the debates, Lincoln would build on this foundation, delivering speeches that refined and deepened his arguments against slavery's expansion. His Cooper Union address in New York in February 1860 would electrify Eastern Republicans with its scholarly demolition of the claim that the Founding Fathers had supported popular sovereignty. His willingness to travel and speak, his gift for making complex constitutional arguments accessible to ordinary citizens, and his reputation for honesty and moral courage would transform him from a regional figure into a serious contender for the presidency. Stephen Douglas had won the battle for the Senate, but Abraham Lincoln, in defeat, had positioned himself to win something far greater: the opportunity to save the Union and to strike the chains from 4 million enslaved people, a destiny that would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. The unleft candidate. The Republican National Convention opened in Chicago on May 16, 1860, in a vast wooden structure called the Wigwam, built specifically for the occasion. The city was packed with delegates, spectators, and supporters of the various candidates, and the atmosphere crackled with the electric intensity of a party that sensed victory was within its grasp. The Democrats were fracturing over slavery, and whoever the Republicans nominated would have an excellent chance of winning the presidency. Abraham Lincoln was not the favorite going into the convention. That distinction belonged to William Seward of New York, the most prominent Republican in the country, a former governor and senator whose opposition to slavery was well known. Seward's supporters were confident, perhaps overconfident, certain that their man would secure the nomination on the first or second ballot. Also in the running was Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, another prominent anti-slavery politician, and several other candidates with regional appeal. Lincoln's team, led by his old friend Judge David Lim, he understood that Lincoln could not win on the first ballot. Their strategy was to position Lincoln as everyone's second choice, the moderate who could unite the party and carry the crucial swing states of Illinois, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. They worked the convention floor tirelessly, making deals, promising cabinet positions, and convincing delegates that while Seward might be too radical for moderate voters, Lincoln was just right. His opposition to slavery's expansion was clear, but he was not an abolitionist. His House Divided speech had made him famous, but he had not alienated conservative Republicans with calls for immediate emancipation. The convention's first ballot went as expected. Seward led with 173.5 votes, but he needed 233 to win the nomination. Lincoln came in second with 102 votes, a stronger showing than many had anticipated. On the second ballot, Lincoln gained ground as several favorite son candidates released their delegates. He now had 181 votes to Seward's 184.5. The momentum had shifted, and everyone in the wigwam could feel it. On the third ballot, delegation after delegation swung to Lincoln. Pennsylvania went for him. Ohio followed. When the final tally was announced, Lincoln had 231.5 votes, just short of the majority. But then, a delegate from Ohio rose and moved to change 4 votes to Lincoln, pushing him over the top. The building erupted in cheers. Cannon outside began to fire. Abraham Lincoln, the former rail splitter from Illinois, the self-taught lawyer who had lost his Senate race just 2 years before, was the Republican nominee for President of the United States. When the news reached Lincoln in Springfield, he was stunned. He had known he had a chance, but he had hardly dared believe that the nomination would actually come to him. Now it had, and with it came the awesome responsibility of leading the Republican Party in the most consequential election the nation had ever faced. The platform on which he would run was clear: no extension of slavery into the territories, support for a transcontinental railroad, free homesteads for settlers, and a protective tariff. But the unspoken reality that everyone understood was that this election was fundamentally about slavery, and whether the Union could continue to exist, half slave and half free. The campaign that followed was unlike any that had come before. Lincoln, following the custom of the time, did not actively campaign for himself. He remained in Springfield, receiving visitors and writing letters, while surrogates spoke on his behalf throughout the North. His strategy was to say nothing that might alienate any faction of the fragile Republican coalition. He had stated his positions clearly in the past, and he saw no need to elaborate on them now. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party tore itself apart. At their convention in Charleston, Southern delegates had demanded that the party platform include federal protection for slavery in the territories, essentially repudiating popular sovereignty. When the Northern delegates refused, the Southerners walked out. The convention reconvened in Baltimore, where Douglas was nominated, but the Southern Democrats held their own convention and nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky on a pro-slavery platform. A fourth candidate, John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, ran on a platform of preserving the Union while avoiding the slavery question altogether. Campaign quickly became regional. In the North, it was a contest between Lincoln and Douglas. In the South, Lincoln was not even on the ballot in most states, and the fight was between Breckinridge and Bell. The fracturing of the opposition gave Lincoln an enormous advantage. He needed to carry the North to win the Electoral College, and with the Democrats divided, that was entirely achievable. As Election Day approached on November 6, 1860, the mood in the South grew increasingly ominous. Southern newspapers and politicians made it clear that if Lincoln won, secession would follow. They had been threatening secession for decades, using it as a weapon to extract concessions on slavery. But this time, the threats had a different quality. This time, they seemed to mean it. A Republican president who opposed slavery's expansion was intolerable to the South, they claimed. It was proof that the North intended to destroy the Southern way of life. Secession was the only option. Lincoln received the election returns in the telegraph office in Springfield. As the results came in from across the North, it became clear that he had won decisively. He would carry every free state except New Jersey, which he would split with Douglas. In the Electoral College, he would have 180 votes to Breckinridge's 72, Bell's 39, and Douglas's 12. But in the popular vote, the picture was more complex. Lincoln received about 40% of the total vote, less than a majority, winning because his opposition was divided among 3 candidates. More troubling still, Lincoln had received almost no votes in the South. He had been elected entirely by the North, making him, in Southern eyes, a purely sectional president with no mandate to govern them. The very fact of his election, regardless of what he might do in office, was seen as an insult and a threat. Within days, South Carolina announced that it would hold a convention to consider secession. Other Deep South states quickly followed. The long-dreaded crisis was at hand. Lincoln spent the months between his election and inauguration in an agony of frustration. As president-elect, he had no power to act, but as the man who would soon take office, he felt the full weight of the coming catastrophe. He watched as President James Buchanan dithered, doing nothing to prevent secession, even tacitly encouraging it by arguing that states had a right to leave the Union. He watched as compromise proposals were floated in Congress, most of them requiring the Republicans to abandon their core principle of preventing slavery's expansion. He watched as one Southern state after another voted to secede, until 7 had formed the Confederate States of America by February 1861. Through it all, Lincoln remained in Springfield, refusing to make any public statements that might either inflame the situation or be seen as backing down from Republican principles. Privately, he was clear. Secession was illegal and would not be tolerated. No compromises could be made that allowed slavery to expand. But the Union could be preserved, he believed, if the South could be convinced that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. His hope was that once he took office and Southern fears proved unfounded, the seceding states would return to the Union. It was a hope that would prove tragically naive. On February 11, 1861, Lincoln left Springfield for Washington, knowing he might never return. He stood on the rear platform of the train and addressed the crowd that had gathered to see him off. His voice was heavy with emotion as he spoke of his years in the town, of the friends he was leaving behind, and of the uncertain future that awaited him. "I now leave," he said, "not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington." The journey to Washington took 12 days, with stops in numerous cities where Lincoln spoke to crowds and met with local leaders. In Philadelphia, he spoke at Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. He reflected on the meaning of that document, on its promise that all should have an equal chance, and he declared that he would rather be assassinated than see that principle abandoned. It was not mere rhetoric. That very night, he was secretly rushed through Baltimore to avoid an assassination plot that had been uncovered by Alan Pinkerton's detectives. Defendants. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the steps of the unfinished Capitol building and took the oath of office as the 16th President of the United States. Sharpshooters were positioned on nearby rooftops, a precaution against assassination. In the crowd were friends and enemies, supporters and those who wished him dead. Lincoln delivered his inaugural address in his high, penetrating voice, speaking directly to the South. He reassured them that he had no intention of interfering with slavery in the states where it existed. He had no legal power to do so, he said, and no inclination. He appealed to their sense of history and shared identity, reminding them that Southerners and Northerners were bound together by ties of affection and common sacrifice. He warned that the Union was perpetual, that no state could legally leave, and that he had taken an oath to preserve, protect, and defend it. But he also pledged that there would be no violence unless violence was forced upon the government. "We are not enemies, but friends," Lincoln concluded. "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Perhaps the most beautiful Lincoln would ever write, but they would not be enough. The better angels of human nature were about to be drowned out by the thunder of cannons and the screams of dying men. In just over a month, the Civil War would begin, and Abraham Lincoln would face the greatest test any American president has ever endured.
Fort Sumter and the coming of war.
Championships. The crisis came to a head over Fort Sumter, a federal installation sitting on an artificial island in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The fort was one of the few remaining pieces of federal property in the seceded states still under Union control, and its commander, Major Robert Anderson, was running out of supplies. President Buchanan had attempted to resupply the fort in January 1861, but the supply ship had been fired upon and forced to turn back. Since then, Anderson and his small garrison had been isolated, waiting to see what the new president would do. Metallissing Francis faced was agonizing. If he attempted to resupply the fort, the Confederates would almost certainly fire on the supply ships, and that would mean war. But if he abandoned the fort, he would be tacitly recognizing the legitimacy of secession and would lose all credibility to enforce federal authority in the South. For weeks, he agonized over the choice, consulting with his cabinet, weighing his options, searching desperately for some way to avoid the catastrophe he saw approaching. In early April, Lincoln made his decision. He would attempt to resupply the fort, but he would notify South Carolina's governor in advance and would send only food, no weapons or reinforcements. If the Confederates allowed the supplies through, the fort would remain in federal hands, but would pose no military threat. If they fired on the supply ships, they would be the ones who started the war, and the moral responsibility for bloodshed would rest with them. Government, led by President Jefferson Davis, faced its own dilemma. If they allowed the fort to be resupplied, they would appear weak and would be admitting that federal authority still existed within their borders. But if they fired on the fort, they would be starting a war they were not prepared to fight. Davis chose confrontation. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment continued for 34 hours. Anderson and his men fought back as best they could, but they were hopelessly outgunned. The fort's walls were pounded by thousands of shells. Fires broke out in the wooden structures inside, and the garrison was nearly suffocated by smoke and fumes. Miraculously, no one on either side was killed during the bombardment, though several men would die in accidental explosions during the surrender ceremony. On April 13th, with his ammunition exhausted and his fort in ruins, Anderson agreed to surrender. Nephew's Fort Sumter's fall electrified the nation. In the South, there was jubilation. The Confederacy had won its first victory, had shown that it was willing to fight for its independence. In the North, there was shock and outrage. The flag had been fired upon, the Union had been attacked. Whatever doubts Northerners might have had about coercing the South to remain in the Union evaporated in the fury that followed Sumter's fall. On April 15th, Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 militia volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The response in the North was overwhelming. Young men rushed to enlist, more than the government could initially equip and train. But Lincoln's call for troops had another, more ominous effect. The 4 slave states that had not yet seceded, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, now faced a choice. Would they provide troops to fight against their southern neighbors, or would they join the Confederacy? All 4 chose secession, doubling the size of the rebel nation and, crucially, bringing Virginia, with its proximity to Washington and its brilliant military leadership, into the Confederate camp. The war that Lincoln had tried so desperately to avoid had begun, and it would be unlike anything anyone had imagined. Both sides expected a short conflict. Northerners believed that once the South realized the Union was serious about restoring federal authority, the rebellion would collapse. Southerners believed that one or two Confederate victories would convince the North that subjugating the South was impossible. Both were catastrophically wrong. Lincoln threw himself into the role of commander-in-chief with an intensity that surprised even those who knew him well. He had virtually no military experience beyond his brief and uneventful service in the Black Hawk War nearly 3 decades earlier. But he possessed something more valuable than military training. He had strategic vision, political skill, and an unshakable determination to preserve the Union at all costs. He began studying military texts, poring over maps, and meeting with military advisors to educate himself about strategy and tactics. He quickly grasped certain basic truths that many of his generals seemed to miss. The Confederacy could not be defeated by capturing territory, including even its capital at Richmond. It could only be defeated by destroying its armies in the field. The Union had overwhelming advantages in population, industry, and resources, and these advantages would tell in a long war. Therefore, the Union must use its superior numbers to attack Confederate armies simultaneously on multiple fronts, preventing the rebels from shifting forces to meet each threat in turn. It was a sound strategic vision, and if Lincoln's generals had followed it, the war might have been over much sooner. But finding generals who were both competent and willing to fight aggressively proved to be one of Lincoln's most frustrating challenges. General Winfield Scott, the venerable hero of the Mexican War, was too old and infirm to take the field. His replacement, George B. McClellan, proved to be a brilliant organizer and trainer of troops, but was paralyzed by caution when it came to actual fighting. McClellan always believed the enemy outnumbered him, always needed more time to prepare, always found reasons to delay. The first group that hears on the coat that Lincoln was also pleased with the enfortered for the clap. The Confederates said that filtrally Smithers Cleland was done for the enforter, the ground with open resulted, and at the beginning of delay than with his factor. The Cleland removed 2 works, so please have another block on set that was over big and proved with enforter, and of focusing for motor that suggestionly. The first rest of the door was provely more. The slocal was a first for McClellan was displipter, the ground with fulleting particular. The other cross that was proved into the over of the enforter, the first particular beginning for stealth, and the first bringing of the unnewly difficult challenge medicated. The first completely continue to say that first military critters, which was the security for general from one. The playering was the problem general beam of the turn. The ground of the enforter is changed toward the black to the troops, and friendly had leaved both 33. That had provided the enemy.
Major battle of the war came in July 1861 at Bull Run, a creek near Manassas, Virginia, just 30 miles from Washington. Lincoln had pushed for an offensive to take advantage of Northern enthusiasm and to strike before the South could fully mobilize. The result was a disaster. Union troops, poorly trained and badly led, were routed by Confederate forces under Generals Joseph Johnston and Pierre Beauregard. The soldiers fled back to Washington in disarray, along with panicked civilians who had ridden out from the capital to watch what they expected to be an easy Union victory. Buster Run shattered any illusions of a short war. It revealed that both sides would fight and fight hard, and that the conflict would be long and bloody. Lincoln responded by appointing McClellan to command the Army of the Potomac, the main Union force in the East. McClellan spent the rest of 1861 and the winter of 1862 drilling and organizing his troops, building them into a formidable fighting force. But when Lincoln urged him to attack, to use his superior numbers to crush the Confederate army before Richmond, McClellan found excuses to delay. Behind early 1862, Lincoln's patience was wearing Susan, that would define his presidency.
that he, the civilian president with no military credentials, would have to drive the war effort forward against the reluctance and incompetence of his own generals. It was an extraordinary burden, made all the heavier by the constant criticism he faced from all sides. Abolitionists attacked him for not moving faster against slavery. Democrats accused him of prosecuting an unnecessary war and trampling on constitutional liberties. His own cabinet was divided, with some members barely concealing their contempt for him. And through it all, the casualty lists grew longer, each one bringing fresh grief to thousands of families across the North. The war would grind on for 4 years, through victories and defeats, advances and retreats, battles whose names would become synonyms for horror. Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Cold Harbor, Petersburg. Before it ended, roughly 620,000 Americans would die, more than in all of America's other wars combined. The United States would be transformed, the federal government expanded and strengthened, slavery destroyed, and the Constitution effectively rewritten. And through it all, Abraham Lincoln would stand at the center of the storm, making decisions that would determine not just the outcome of the war, but the very nature of American democracy itself.
The general who would not fight.
Was everything Abraham Lincoln was not. He was handsome, polished, a graduate of West Point who had distinguished himself in the Mexican War. He had studied military operations in Europe, had worked as a railroad executive, and had a mind ideally suited to the complex logistics of moving and supplying large armies. His soldiers adored him. They called him Little Mac and cheered when he rode past their encampments. He was, by all appearances, the ideal man to lead the Union Army to victory. But McClellan had a fatal flaw. He was terrified of failure. Despite his meticulous planning and his talent for organization, when the moment came to commit his forces to battle, he always hesitated. He consistently overestimated Confederate strength, convinced himself that he was outnumbered, even when he had overwhelming numerical superiority, and delayed attacking until conditions were absolutely perfect. Those conditions, of course, never arrived. Lincoln watched McClellan's hesitation with growing frustration. Through the winter of 1861-62, as the Army of the Potomac grew to more than 100,000 men, superbly equipped and trained, McClellan did nothing. He paraded his troops, he held reviews, he promised that he would move when the time was right. But he did not move. Lincoln, who had no military training but possessed an abundance of common sense, could not understand why McClellan would not attack. The Confederate army defending Richmond was smaller, its supplies were limited, and each day of delay gave the South more time to strengthen its defenses. Finally, in March 1862, McClellan launched what he called the Peninsula Campaign. Rather than attacking Richmond directly from the north, which would have been the shortest route, he loaded his entire army onto ships and transported them to the Virginia Peninsula, planning to approach Richmond from the east. It was a clever plan in some ways, but it gave up the advantage of the Union's superior railroads and put the army in difficult terrain where it could be more easily defended against. The Peninsula Campaign began well enough. McClellan's army advanced slowly up the peninsula, capturing Yorktown and pushing toward Richmond. By late May 1862, Union forces were just 7 miles from the Confederate capital. The city seemed ready to fall. But then, at the Battle of Seven Pines on May 31st, Confederate forces under Joseph Johnston attacked McClellan's army. The battle was inconclusive, but Johnston was wounded, and command of the Confederate forces passed to Robert E. Lee. Leeds would prove to be McClellan's nemesis, and, in many ways, the Confederacy's salvation. Where McClellan was cautious, Lee was aggressive. Where McClellan worried about what might go wrong, Lee sought opportunities to strike. In late June, Lee launched what became known as the 7 Days Battles, a series of attacks on McClellan's army that drove the Union forces away from Richmond and back down the peninsula toward the James River. McClellan, convinced that he was facing an enemy twice his actual size, retreated repeatedly, abandoning his offensive and ultimately abandoning the entire campaign. Lincoln was furious. He had given McClellan everything he had asked for: men, supplies, and time, and the result was failure. The Army of the Potomac was intact, but it had accomplished nothing except to waste months and thousands of lives. In July, Lincoln visited McClellan's camp at Harrison's Landing to see the situation for himself. What he found was an army that had lost none of its fighting capability, but had a commander who had lost his nerve. Lincoln began looking for a general who would fight. He consolidated the scattered Union forces in Northern Virginia under General John Pope, and ordered Pope to advance on Richmond from the north, while McClellan withdrew from the peninsula. The strategy had merit, but Pope proved to be both arrogant and incompetent. At the Second Battle of Bull Run in late August 1862, Lee and Stonewall Jackson outmaneuvered Pope and inflicted a crushing defeat on his army. Once again, Union forces retreated in disorder toward Washington. With Pope's failure, Lincoln had no choice but to turn back to McClellan, who still commanded the loyalty of the Army of the Potomac. McClellan resumed command and moved to intercept Lee, who had decided to invade Maryland in hopes of winning a decisive victory on northern soil that might bring European recognition of the Confederacy. The two armies met at Antietam Creek on September 17, 1862, in what would become the bloodiest single day in American history. The Battle of Antietam was a tactical draw, but a strategic Union victory. Lee's army was battered and forced to retreat back into Virginia. McClellan had the opportunity to pursue and possibly destroy Lee's army, which would have ended the war. But once again, McClellan hesitated. He claimed his army was too exhausted, that he needed more supplies, that the risk of attack was too great. Lincoln sent him urgent telegrams, practically begging him to pursue Lee, but McClellan did not move. This time, Lincoln's patience was exhausted. In November 1862, he removed McClellan from command. It was a difficult decision, for McClellan was popular with both the troops and the Democratic Party, which would use his removal as ammunition to attack Lincoln in the coming elections. But the war could not be won by a general who refused to fight, and Lincoln knew he had no choice. Brushing for a fighting general would continue for 2 more agonizing years. Ambrose Burnside, McClellan's replacement, proved willing to attack, but lacked the strategic sense to do so effectively. At Fredericksburg in December 1862, he sent wave after wave of Union soldiers against an impregnable Confederate position on a fortified ridge, resulting in a slaughter that horrified the nation. Joseph Hooker, who replaced Burnside, seemed promising, but was outmaneuvered by Lee at Chancellorsville in May 1863, resulting in another humiliating Union defeat. Through all these failures, Lincoln bore the weight of command, largely alone. He studied the maps, read the casualty reports, and made the difficult decisions about which generals to retain and which to remove. He endured the criticism from all sides, the accusations that he was incompetent, that he was a tyrant, that he was prolonging the war unnecessarily. The strain showed in his face, in the deep lines that etched themselves across his features, in the haunted look that appeared in photographs from this period. But Lincoln never wavered in his commitment to saving the Union. He had come to see the war as a test, not just of military strength, but of democratic ideals. Could a government based on popular consent survive a rebellion? Could democracy prove itself capable of defending itself against those who would destroy it? These questions drove him forward even in the darkest moments, even when victory seemed impossible. And finally, in March 1864, Lincoln found the general he had been searching for. Ulysses S. Grant, who had won crucial victories in the West, capturing Forts Henry and Donelson, and, most importantly, Vicksburg, was promoted to command all Union armies. Grant understood what Lincoln had been trying to communicate to his generals all along, that the war would be won not by clever maneuvers or the capture of cities, but by the relentless destruction of Confederate armies. He was willing to accept casualties, willing to keep attacking even when battles went badly, willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve victory. Grant's arrival marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. But it would still take another year of brutal fighting, including some of the war's bloodiest battles, before Lee would finally surrender at Appomattox. And before that moment arrived, Lincoln would make the decision that would transform the war from a struggle to preserve the Union into a crusade for human freedom. The proclamation that changed everything. From the beginning of the war, abolitionists had pressured Abraham Lincoln to make emancipation a war aim. Figures like Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave who had become the most prominent black voice in America, argued passionately that the war could never be truly won unless slavery was destroyed. How, they asked, could the Union claim to be fighting for freedom while 4 million people remained in bondage? Radical Republicans in Congress echoed this sentiment, introducing legislation to confiscate slave property and to prohibit the return of escaped slaves to their masters. Lincoln listened to these arguments, and part of him agreed with them. He had always believed slavery was morally wrong, but he was also painfully aware of the constitutional and political constraints he faced as president. The Constitution protected slavery in the states where it existed. He had taken an oath to preserve, protect, and defend that Constitution, not to subvert it. Moreover, 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, had remained loyal to the Union. If Lincoln moved too quickly toward emancipation, he risked driving these crucial border states into the Confederacy, which could tip the military balance decisively against the Union. So through the first year and a half of the war, Lincoln moved cautiously on the slavery question. He countermanded orders by Union generals who attempted to free slaves in their military districts. He proposed gradual, compensated emancipation to the border states, offering to have the federal government pay slaveholders for their enslaved people if they would voluntarily free them. He even supported, at least initially, the idea of colonization, resettling freed black Americans in Africa or Central America, a plan that reflected both his racial prejudices and his doubts about whether a peaceful, integrated society was possible. But events were pushing Lincoln toward a more radical position. Thousands of enslaved people were fleeing to Union lines, seeking freedom under the protection of federal troops. These contraband, as they came to be called, provided valuable labor for the Union Army and intelligence about Confederate movements. More importantly, their flight demonstrated that enslaved people themselves were actively fighting for their freedom, forcing the war to become about slavery, whether Lincoln wanted it to be or not. Submerged by the summer of 1862, Lincoln had come to a decision. He would issue a proclamation freeing the slaves in the rebellious states, using his authority as commander-in-chief to strike at the economic foundation of the Confederacy. It would not free enslaved people in the border states, for the Constitution still protected slavery there, and Lincoln had no war powers authority over loyal states. But it would transform the war's meaning, making it a struggle not just for Union, but for human freedom. Lincoln shared his decision with his cabinet on July 22, 1862. The reaction was mixed. Some members supported the move wholeheartedly. Others worried about the political consequences or doubted Lincoln's constitutional authority to take such a step. But the most important advice came from Secretary of State William Seward, who urged Lincoln to wait before issuing the proclamation. If Lincoln announced emancipation in the wake of military defeats like the Peninsula Campaign and Second Bull Run, Seward argued, it would look like an act of desperation, a last gasp of a failing government. Better to wait for a military victory so that the proclamation could be issued from a position of strength. Lincoln agreed, and for the next 2 months he waited, carrying the draft proclamation in his desk drawer while the war ground on. Then came Antietam. Though the battle was not the decisive victory Lincoln had hoped for, it was enough. Lee's invasion of the North had been turned back. The Union Army had held the field. On September 22, 1862,
5 days after Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Document gave the Confederacy an ultimatum. If the rebellious states returned to the Union by January 1, 1863, slavery would be left untouched. But if they remained in rebellion, all slaves in those states would be declared free. It was, in effect, a final peace offer. Return to the Union, and the old order would continue fighting, and the social and economic foundation of Southern society would be destroyed. The Confederacy, of course, refused. The states would be note the new states in Southern being become world, which would with first blue arns. The critical to the Southern would be destroyed. The Southern problems for the revealed in this community, it was making the future of lowly with a future of life. The dogment bar the way, they would field with lightful anywhere. The Confederacy behind, of course, refused. Southern leaders were outraged by what they saw as an attempt to incite slave rebellion. They had no intention of returning to the Union under any circumstances. And so, on January 1, 1863, as the nation watched and waited, Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. The document itself was not the soaring piece of rhetoric that many had expected. It was a legal document, carefully worded to rest on Lincoln's war powers as Commander-in-Chief. It named specific states and parts of states where slaves were declared free, exempting areas already under Union control and the loyal border states. It authorized the enrollment of black men in the Union military. It invoked the justice of the measure and asked for God's judgment upon it. But for all its dry, legalistic language, the Emancipation Proclamation was a revolutionary document. It transformed the Civil War from a struggle to preserve the Union into a war for human freedom. It invited enslaved people to free themselves by escaping to Union lines or by rising up against their masters. It declared that every advance of Union armies would be an advance of freedom. And it committed the United States government, for the first time in its history, to the destruction of slavery. The immediate impact of the proclamation was profound. Across the North, abolitionists celebrated. They had pushed Lincoln toward this moment for 2 years, and now, at last, their moral vision was becoming national policy. Black communities in particular rejoiced. At watch night services on New Year's Eve 1862, black churches across the North waited for news of the proclamation, and when word came that Lincoln had indeed signed it, the celebrations were ecstatic. Frederick Douglass, who had been Lincoln's most eloquent critic on emancipation, now declared that the proclamation was a great step forward, the beginning of slavery's end. The South, the reaction was fury and fear. White Southerners saw the proclamation as an attempt to incite slave rebellion and as proof that Lincoln intended to destroy their society. They vowed to fight harder than ever, to never submit to a government that would free their slaves. But enslaved people themselves heard the news differently. Word of the proclamation spread through the slave quarters by a mysterious grapevine that no amount of white surveillance could suppress. When Union armies approached, enslaved people fled to their lines in increasing numbers, seeking the freedom that Lincoln had promised. And crucially, the proclamation opened the door for black men to enlist in the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors would serve in the Union forces before the war's end, fighting with a courage and determination that impressed even skeptical white observers. They knew they were fighting for more than abstract principles. They were fighting for their own freedom and for the freedom of their families and communities still in bondage. Their service would prove essential to Union victory and would give black Americans a powerful moral claim to full citizenship. Lincoln himself understood the significance of what he had done. In the dark days that followed the proclamation, when Union military fortunes were at a low ebb, he told a visitor that he believed the Emancipation Proclamation was the central act of his administration, the moment when the war took on its true meaning. He had issued it, he said, after much deliberation and prayer, convinced that it was both a military necessity and a moral imperative. And he had come to see it as irreversible. There could be no going back, no compromise that would restore slavery, even in the rebellious states. The proclamation had committed the nation to a new birth of freedom, and Lincoln would spend the rest of his life working to ensure that promise was kept. Gettysburg, the turning point. By the summer of 1863, the war had ground on for more than 2 years with no decisive resolution. The Confederacy had proven far more resilient than the North had expected. Despite the Union's overwhelming advantages in population, industry, and resources, Southern armies had fought the North to a standstill in the East, while achieving some successes in the West. The Confederate strategy was one of exhaustion. Hold on long enough, inflict enough casualties, make the war costly enough, and eventually, Northern public opinion would turn against the conflict, and Lincoln would be forced to negotiate peace on Confederate terms. Berry, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, decided in June 1863 to launch his second invasion of the North. His first attempt, in September 1862, had ended at Antietam, but Lee believed that another invasion, if successful, might achieve what the Confederacy needed. A major victory on Northern soil could convince Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy and provide crucial diplomatic and material support. It could strengthen the peace Democrats in the North who were calling for an end to the war. And it would relieve the pressure on Confederate territory by moving the fighting north. Lee's army crossed the Potomac into Maryland and then pushed into Pennsylvania, living off the abundant farms and prosperous towns of the North. The Army of the Potomac, now under the command of George Gordon Meade, who had replaced the disgraced Joseph Hooker just days earlier, moved north in pursuit. The two armies, each more than 70,000 strong, marched on roads that were converging toward a small market town in south-central Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. On the morning of July 1, 1863, advance units of the two armies collided west of Gettysburg. What began as a skirmish rapidly escalated as both sides poured reinforcements into the fight. By afternoon, a full-scale battle was underway. Confederate forces, attacking from the north and west, gradually pushed the Union troops back through the town to the high ground south of Gettysburg, including Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. The Union troops had taken heavy casualties, but they had secured the crucial high ground, and during the night, more Union forces arrived, strengthening their position. July 2nd saw fierce fighting as Lee, determined to drive the Union army from its position, ordered attacks on both flanks of the Union line. On the Union left, Confederate forces under James Longstreet assaulted positions with names that would become legendary: Little Round Top, the Wheat Field, the Peach Orchard, Devil's Den. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand in many places, with casualties mounting by the thousands. Union defenders, including the 20th Maine Regiment under Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, held on by the slimmest margins, sometimes beating back Confederate attackers with bayonets and rocks when their ammunition ran out. On the Union right, Confederate attacks on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill were also repulsed, though at terrible cost. July 2nd, both armies were exhausted and bloodied, but the Union line held. Lee, against the advice of Longstreet, decided to make one more massive assault the following day. He believed that Meade had weakened his center to reinforce his flanks, and that a concentrated attack there could break through and split the Union army in two. On the afternoon of July 3rd, after a massive artillery bombardment that accomplished little except to give the Union defenders time to take cover, approximately 12,500 Confederate soldiers formed up for an assault across 3/4 of a mile of open ground toward the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Leading the charge were divisions commanded by George Pickett, Johnston Pettigrew, and Isaac Trimble. What followed would be remembered as Pickett's Charge, one of the most famous and tragic attacks in military history. The Confederate soldiers advanced in parade ground formation, their battle flags flying, heading directly toward a copse of trees that marked their objective.
Union artillery opened fire, tearing great gaps in the advancing lines. As the Confederates came closer, Union infantry rose from behind a stone wall and poured devastating volleys into the Southern ranks. A few hundred Confederates, led by General Lewis Armistead, briefly reached the Union line at a spot forever after known as the high watermark of the Confederacy. But they were quickly killed or captured. The rest of the assault force broke and retreated back across the field, leaving thousands of dead and wounded behind. Lee rode out to meet his shattered troops, tears in his eyes, telling them that it was all his fault and that they should rally on him. But there would be no rally. The Army of Northern Virginia had suffered catastrophic casualties, roughly 28,000 killed, wounded, or missing over the 3 days of battle. The Union had lost almost as many, about 23,000. Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the war, with total casualties approaching 51,000 men. The small town became a charnel house, with wounded men filling every building and makeshift hospitals overflowing. On July 4th, as Lee's army began with 3 Thirst and the 2004th of the put against formy of his Pallone. On July 4th, as the court of the directively player, with main 3 works that men was the reached in the quarter of the war. On July 4th, as Lee's been to tend into the loan that charities, which is most protagainst that being remember that the Army of Northern Virginia, as they performed the wounded men and wounded, and they returned the blue man. On July 4th, as Lee's command be forted, but for desire forters that the race of men and bloom. The government being a chalk for the small parent, they curt that was a release that children's defence the chewed. The beginning from the first time was just a temper for some of the Union line and simply poter his world. Also too, as Lee's army began its retreat back to Virginia, the news arrived of another Union victory. Ulysses S. Grant had captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, after a long siege, opening the Mississippi River to Union control and splitting the Confederacy in 2. July 4th, 1863, became the day the war turned decisively in the Union's favor. The Confederacy would fight on for almost 2 more years, but it would never again have the strength to launch a major offensive into Union territory. Lincoln was elated by the news of Gettysburg, but frustrated by what followed. Meade, cautious like so many Union generals before him, did not pursue Lee's retreating army aggressively. Heavy rains swelled the Potomac River, trapping Lee against the water with nowhere to go. Lincoln urged Meade to attack, to finish Lee's army while it was vulnerable. But Meade hesitated, waiting, and Lee managed to construct pontoon bridges and escape back into Virginia. Lincoln was devastated. He had come so close to ending the war, and once again, a general's caution had allowed the opportunity to slip away. But Gettysburg had still accomplished something crucial. It had proven that the Confederate army was not invincible, that Lee could be beaten, and that Union soldiers could stand and fight with courage equal to their Southern counterparts. More than that, it had given Lincoln an opportunity to redefine the war's meaning for the nation and for the world. On November 19, 1863, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg for the dedication of a national cemetery on the battlefield. The main speaker was Edward Everett, a former senator, governor, and president of Harvard, one of the most famous orators in America. Everett spoke for 2 hours, delivering an eloquent, classically structured address that reviewed the battle in detail and placed it in historical context. Then Lincoln rose to deliver a few appropriate remarks. He spoke for less than 3 minutes. His address was just 272 words long. Many in the crowd barely realized the president had finished before he sat down. But those words, carefully crafted and deliberately chosen, would become the most famous speech in American history. 74 years ago, Lincoln began, reaching back not to the Constitution of 1787, but to the Declaration of Independence of 1776, grounding the nation's meaning in the revolutionary promise that all men are created equal. He described the war as a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could long endure. He reminded his listeners that the brave men who fought and died at Gettysburg had consecrated the ground far more than any words could. And he concluded with a call to action, that the nation must ensure that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Getty Address redefined the Civil War. It was no longer just about preserving the Union as it had been, but about creating a new nation where the promise of equality would finally be fulfilled. It transformed the war dead into martyrs for human freedom and gave their sacrifice a meaning that transcended the specific battles they had fought. And it articulated a vision of democracy that remains, to this day, the most eloquent expression of American ideals ever written. Initial reaction to the address was divided along partisan lines. Republican newspapers praised it. Democratic papers dismissed it as inappropriate or inadequate. But Edward Everett, who knew something about great oratory, wrote to Lincoln the next day, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Over time, as the speech was reprinted, memorized, and studied, its genius became apparent. It had done what great art always does. It had taken a specific moment and made it universal, had spoken to its time and to all time. Standing on that battlefield in November 1863, Lincoln could not have known that he had just delivered the speech that would define his legacy more than any military victory or legislative achievement. But he knew he had spoken truth. The war was about more than territory or political power. It was about whether the great experiment in self-government that began in 1776 could survive its greatest test. And in those 272 words, Lincoln had given voice to why that survival mattered, not just for Americans, but for all humanity. The Long Road to Appomattox. Unmistake 4 and 1865 brought both the war's darkest moments and its final resolution. With Ulysses S. Grant now in command of all Union armies, the strategy Lincoln had always advocated would finally be implemented. Simultaneous offensives on multiple fronts, using the Union's superior numbers to stretch Confederate resources to the breaking point. Grant would lead the Army of the Potomac in Virginia against Lee. William T. Sherman would drive through Georgia toward Atlanta. Smaller armies would operate in the Shenandoah Valley and along the Atlantic coast. The Confederacy would be squeezed from all sides until it could no longer resist. In May 1864, Lincoln hid stories only of the war, but not prison with making phones. In May 1864, Sherman would command stretch the coast on a freedman beats with most presidenter. The strategy would each of the others discerned on the tranvitation. In May 1864, Sherman would bound the board and the skoke with most Christmas presidenter from all Nate with battle husband with making board. In May 1863, Sherman would drive through Georgia toward Atlanta. Overland campaign, moving his army south toward Richmond in a series of brutal battles through the Virginia wilderness. At the Battle of the Wilderness, the Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor, Union forces suffered horrific casualties, sometimes more than 50,000 in a single month. In earlier years, such losses would have forced a Union general to retreat and reorganize. But Grant was different. He kept moving forward, sliding around Lee's flank after each battle, forcing Lee to retreat toward Richmond to protect the Confederate capital. The casualties shocked the North. Newspapers called Grant a butcher, accusing him of wasting lives in futile frontal assaults. But Lincoln, who understood the mathematics of attrition, stood by his general. The Union could replace its losses, the Confederacy could not. Each battle weakened Lee's army more than Grant's, bringing the war closer to its conclusion. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," Grant wrote, and Lincoln endorsed his determination. By June, Grant had pushed Lee's army back to Petersburg, a critical railroad junction south of Richmond. Unable to break Lee's fortified lines in direct assault, Grant settled into a siege that would last 9 months. It was grinding, unglamorous warfare, a war of trenches and artillery bombardments that foreshadowed the horrors of the Western Front in World War I. But it was effective. Each week, Lee's army grew weaker, its supply lines more tenuous, its ability to maneuver more constrained. Meanwhile, Sherman marched through Georgia, taking Atlanta in September 1864, a victory that came at a crucial moment. Lincoln faced re-election in November, and his prospects had looked grim through the summer as the casualty lists grew and battlefield victories remained elusive. The Democratic Party nominated George McClellan on a platform that effectively called for peace negotiations with the Confederacy, which would have meant accepting Southern independence. Many Republicans doubted that Lincoln could win, and even Lincoln himself believed he would probably lose. But Atlanta changed everything. Sherman's victory proved that the war was being won, that Grant's strategy was working, that Union victory was now just a matter of time. Lincoln won re-election decisively, carrying all but 3 states and winning more than 55% of the popular vote. Remarkably, he won by large margins among soldiers voting in the field, the men who were actually fighting the war. They understood what was at stake and trusted Lincoln to see it through. Terminated a delivered on March 4, 1865, with the end of the war finally in sight, Lincoln delivered what many consider his greatest speech, surpassing even the Gettysburg Address in its moral and theological depth. He reflected on the war's meaning, acknowledging that both North and South had read the same Bible and prayed to the same God. Yet the war had come anyway. Perhaps, he suggested, it was God's judgment on the sin of slavery, a sin in which both sections of the country had participated. If God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still, it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. But not with vengeance, but with compassion, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. It was a vision of reconciliation, of healing rather than punishment. Lincoln had come to believe that the goal was not to humiliate the South, but to bring it back into the Union with its dignity intact, to treat Southerners not as conquered enemies, but as fellow citizens who had strayed. He knew that this vision would face fierce opposition from radical Republicans who wanted harsh terms for the defeated Confederacy. But he was determined to pursue it. In late March, Sherman completed his march through Georgia and the Carolinas, his armies leaving a trail of destruction, but also breaking the South's will to continue. Lee's army, trapped in Petersburg and shrinking daily from desertion and casualties, could no longer hold its position. On April 2nd, Lee abandoned Petersburg and Richmond and began a desperate retreat west, hoping to join with other Confederate forces and continue the fight. Grant pursued relentlessly. For a week, the two armies raced across Virginia, skirmishing constantly, with Grant gradually cutting off Lee's escape routes. Finally, on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee acknowledged that further resistance was futile. He sent a message to Grant, requesting a meeting to discuss terms of surrender. The two generals met in the parlor of the McLean House in Appomattox. Grant, who had known Lee slightly during the Mexican War, was generous in his terms. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms and personal property. All soldiers who gave their word not to take up arms against the United States could return home. And most importantly, Grant provided rations for Lee's starving army. As Lee rode away from the meeting to inform his troops that the war was over, Grant ordered his men not to celebrate, not to fire salutes. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." Breasts of Lee's surrender reached Washington on April 10. The city erupted in celebration. The long nightmare was ending at last. 4 years of war, 620,000 dead, and incalculable suffering, all of it finally coming to a close. Lincoln joined in the celebrations, though even in his joy there was a weight of sadness. So many had died, so much had been destroyed, and the work of reconstruction, of binding up the nation's wounds, had only just begun. On the evening of April 11th, Lincoln delivered what would be his last public address from a White House window to a crowd that had gathered to celebrate victory. He spoke about Reconstruction, about his plans for bringing the Southern states back into the Union, and he made a statement that would seal his fate. He said he believed that suffrage should be granted to some black men, particularly those who had served in the Union military and those who were educated. It was a modest proposal by modern standards, far less than full equality. But in 1865, it was radical, and there were those who would kill rather than see it happen. In the crowd listening to Lincoln's speech was a young actor named John Wilkes Booth. When he heard Lincoln speak of black suffrage, Booth turned to a companion and said, "That means Negro citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through. That is the last speech he will ever make." Good Friday, 1865. Bless, the morning of April 14, 1865, dawned bright and clear over Washington. It was Good Friday, and the city was still buzzing with celebrations over Lee's surrender 5 days earlier. Abraham Lincoln woke early, as was his custom, his tall frame unfolding from a bed that was too short for his unusual height. He had slept better than he had in weeks. The crushing weight of the war, which had borne down upon his shoulders for 4 years, had finally lifted. The Union was saved. Slavery was being destroyed. The great work of his presidency was nearly complete. Lincoln was in remarkably good spirits. He joked with his son, Tad, played with the boy's toy soldiers, and spoke with Mary about his plans for the future. He wanted to travel, he told her, to see the country he had fought so hard to preserve. He talked of visiting California, of seeing the Pacific Ocean. He spoke of his plans to return to Illinois, to practice law again, perhaps to live a quieter life after the presidency. Mary later recalled that she had never seen him so happy, so unburdened. That morning, Lincoln met with his cabinet. General Grant attended, and Lincoln asked him to describe the final campaign that had led to Lee's surrender. The president also spoke about Reconstruction, about his hopes for a generous peace that would welcome the Southern states back without vindictiveness. He wanted to begin healing the nation's wounds as quickly as possible, to prove that democracy could survive even this terrible test and emerge stronger. Around noon, Lincoln took a carriage ride with Mary. It was a rare moment of peace, a chance to be together without the constant demands of office pressing upon them. They rode through Washington, and Lincoln spoke again of the future, of the good years ahead now that the war was ending. Mary would remember his words as almost prophetic, as if he somehow sensed that their time together was drawing to a close. That evening, Lincoln and Mary planned to attend a performance at Ford's Theatre, a comfortable theatre on 10th Street that Lincoln had visited several times before. The play was Our American Cousin, a popular comedy. General and Mrs. Grant had been invited to join them, but the Grants declined, apparently due to Julia Grant's dislike of Mary Lincoln. In their place, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris agreed to accompany the Lincolns. John Wilkes Booth learned that Booth was a well-known actor from a famous theatrical family, handsome, charismatic, and passionately devoted to the Confederate cause. For months, he had been plotting to kidnap Lincoln, to take him to Richmond and exchange him for Confederate prisoners. But with the Confederacy's collapse, Kidnapping was no longer an option. Booth decided on a more desperate measure: assassination. He would kill Lincoln. His co-conspirators would simultaneously kill Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. The Union government would be decapitated, and somehow, miraculously, the Confederate cause might be revived. Mosk spent the day making preparations. He was intimately familiar with Ford's Theatre, having performed there many times. He knew the layout, knew where the president's box was located, knew the back passages and exits. He arranged for a horse to be ready behind the theatre for his escape. He drank throughout the day to steel his nerves, and he visited the theatre in the afternoon to confirm Lincoln's attendance and to prepare the door to the presidential box so he could enter undetected. The Lincolns arrived at Ford's Theatre late, around 8:30 p.m., after the play had already begun. The performance stopped as the orchestra played "Hail to the Chief," and the audience rose to applaud. Lincoln, acknowledging the ovation with a slight bow, made his way to the presidential box on the right side of the theatre, on the second level. The box had been decorated with American flags in honor of his visit. Lincoln settled into a rocking chair, positioned so he could see the stage. Mary sat beside him. Rathbone and Harris took seats toward the back of the box. The presidential box should have been secure. A White House guard named John Parker had been assigned to protect the president. But Parker, whose record was marked by neglect of duty, abandoned his post sometime during the first act, possibly to get a drink at a nearby tavern. The door to the presidential box was unguarded. Continued, Lincoln relaxed in his chair, laughing at the comedy, his mind finally at ease. Around 10:15 p.m., during the third act, John Wilkes Booth slipped into the narrow hallway behind the presidential box. He carried a single-shot Derringer pistol and a large knife. He carefully opened the door to the box, which he had earlier prepared with a wooden brace so it could be jammed shut from inside, ensuring no one could quickly follow him. Booth entered the box silently. The presidential party was absorbed in the play, unaware of his presence. He stepped forward, raised the Derringer, and fired a single shot into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. The bullet entered behind the left ear, tore through Lincoln's brain, and lodged behind his right eye. The president slumped forward in his chair, mortally wounded. Maxwell Rathbone, realizing what had happened, lunged at Booth. The two men struggled briefly before Booth slashed Rathbone's arm with his knife, cutting deep into the major's flesh. Then Booth vaulted over the railing of the box, intending to land dramatically on the stage 12 feet below and escape through the back of the theatre. But his spur caught on the Treasury flag decorating the box, and he landed awkwardly, breaking his left leg. Still, he managed to rise, turn to the stunned audience, and shout, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the motto of Virginia. Witnesses reported he also shouted, "The South is avenged." Sluggish Booth hobbled across the stage and out the back door of the theatre, where his horse waited. He mounted, despite his broken leg, and rode off into the night. Behind him, Ford's Theatre erupted in chaos. Screams filled the air. Mary Lincoln's wails could be heard throughout the theatre as she cradled her husband's head. Doctors in the audience rushed to the presidential box, but they could do nothing. The wound was mortal. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He was carried across the street to the Peterson House, a boarding house, where he was placed diagonally across a bed too short for his frame. Throughout the night, members of his cabinet, military officers, and family members kept vigil. Mary Lincoln, nearly hysterical with grief, was periodically brought to see her dying husband. The doctors knew there was no hope, but they made him as comfortable as possible and watched as his breathing gradually weakened. Meanwhile, Washington became a scene of panic and rage. Booth's co-conspirator Lewis Powell had attacked Secretary of State Seward in his bed, stabbing him repeatedly, though Seward would survive. George Atzerodt, assigned to kill Vice President Johnson, lost his nerve and got drunk instead. Soldiers flooded the streets, searching for the assassins, rounding up suspects, imposing order on a city that seemed on the verge of tearing itself apart. At 7:22 on the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln's breathing stopped. The 16th President of the United States, the man who had saved the Union and freed 4 million enslaved people, was dead at the age of 56. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had often clashed with Lincoln but had come to revere him, spoke words that would echo through history. Now he belongs to the ages, the legacy that will not die. Delights. Tungal, the funeral train that carried Abraham Lincoln's body from Washington back to Springfield, Illinois, retraced the route he had taken to his inauguration 4 years earlier. It stopped in city after city: Baltimore, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Chicago, and at each stop thousands lined up to view the president's body lying in state. The train traveled by night, and along the entire route people gathered by the tracks, holding torches and lanterns, standing in silent tribute as the funeral car passed through the darkness. The nation was in shock. Victory celebrations had been replaced by mourning. Black crepe draped public buildings and private homes. Church bells tolled. Newspapers that had attacked Lincoln mercilessly during his presidency now praised him as a martyr. The assassination had transformed him overnight from a controversial political figure into a symbol of the Union's triumph and the price of that triumph. In death, Lincoln was becoming the myth he would remain: Father Abraham, the great emancipator, the savior of the Union. The assassination triggered the largest manhunt with goes to the blacks of New People. The nation was becoming the lust for political figure. In death, the nation was coming in place that made me match more shit. The nation worked triggered the last was imparter, the flat of the Union, the long way that films together the country which was mated one of class. The most great people had still both flatter with an inside that challenges work, the nation that we come to the flat. The assassination triggered the little bricks that funding Wattingham base where become a real different place, sending the largest manhunt in American history to that date. John Wilkes Booth and his accomplice David Herold fled south through Maryland, hiding in swamps and pine thickets, aided by Confederate sympathizers who provided food and shelter. They crossed into Virginia, but Union cavalry was close behind. On April 26th, 12 days after the assassination, Federal troops surrounded Booth and Herold in a tobacco barn near Port Royal, Virginia. Herold surrendered, but Booth refused. The troops set fire to the barn to force him out, and in the confusion, Booth was shot, either by a soldier or by his own hand. He was dragged from the burning barn, paralyzed by a bullet that had severed his spine, and died a few hours later on the porch of the nearby farmhouse. Ballistic Hill's co-conspirators were quickly rounded up and put on trial before a military commission. The proceedings were swift and the verdicts harsh. 4 defendants, Lewis Powell, David Herold, George Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt, the boarding house owner in whose establishment the conspirators had met, were sentenced to death and hanged on July 7, 1865. Mary Surratt became the first woman executed by the federal government, and her guilt remains a subject of historical debate. Other conspirators received prison sentences. But the question that haunted the nation was larger than the fate of Booth's accomplices. What would happen now? Lincoln had been planning for reconciliation, for a generous peace that would welcome the Southern states back into the Union. Now he was gone, and in his place was Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat who had been added to the ticket in 1864 to broaden its appeal. Johnson lacked Lincoln's political skill, his moral vision, and his ability to unite factions. The battle over Reconstruction would dominate American politics for the next decade, and without Lincoln's guiding hand, it would become far more bitter and punitive than he had intended. The immediate task facing the nation was to complete the work Lincoln had begun. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery throughout the United States,
had passed the Senate in April 1864, but had initially failed in the House. Lincoln had lobbied hard for its passage, using all his political capital to convince enough Democrats to switch their votes. The amendment finally passed the House on January 31, 1865, and Lincoln signed it, though his signature was not technically necessary. He would not live to see it ratified by the states, but that ratification came in December 1865, making the destruction of slavery permanent and constitutional. The 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons born in the United States, would follow in 1868. The 15th Amendment, prohibiting racial discrimination in voting, came in 1870. Together, these Reconstruction amendments represented the fulfillment of Lincoln's vision, the new birth of freedom he had promised at Gettysburg. But their implementation would be incomplete, and their promise betrayed in the decades that followed, as Reconstruction gave way to segregation and the terror of white supremacy reasserted itself across the South. Lincoln's legacy would be contested and reinterpreted by each generation. To the generation that lived through the Civil War, he was the man who saved the Union, period. The emancipation of the slaves, while important, was secondary to the preservation of the nation. But as time passed and the horror of slavery became clearer to later generations, Lincoln came to be remembered primarily as the great emancipator, the president who freed the slaves and gave America a chance to live up to its founding ideals. The truth, as always, is more complex. Lincoln was not the flawless saint of popular mythology. He held racial prejudices common to his time. He prioritized saving the Union over ending slavery for most of the war. He suspended habeas corpus, arrested critics, and exercised war powers that stretched constitutional limits. His plan for Reconstruction was generous to former Confederates, perhaps too generous, and might not have adequately protected the rights of freed slaves if it had been fully implemented. But Lincoln was also, by any measure, one of the greatest leaders in human history. He took office facing the greatest crisis in American history, with no relevant experience and little reason to believe he could succeed. Yet he held the Union together through 4 years of apocalyptic warfare. He evolved from opposing only slavery's expansion to demanding its complete destruction. He articulated a vision of democratic government that remains inspiring more than 150 years after his death. He combined political shrewdness with moral courage, pragmatism with principle. And he did all this while suffering from periodic bouts of severe depression that would have incapacitated a lesser man. Lincoln's words have echoed through the ages, shaping American discourse on democracy and equality. The Gettysburg Address is taught in schools and recited in ceremonies. The second inaugural address is carved in stone on the walls of the Lincoln Memorial. His phrases, "A house divided," "The better angels of our nature," "Government of the people," "By the people," "For the people," have become part of the American vocabulary, concepts so fundamental to national identity that their origin is sometimes forgotten. Theological. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, activists invoked Lincoln's name and drew on his legacy. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, consciously linking the struggle for civil rights to the unfinished work of emancipation. The march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965 took place exactly 100 years after Lincoln's second inauguration, and participants understood themselves as continuing the work Lincoln had begun. Forever, every American president since Lincoln has been measured against him. His combination of eloquence, moral clarity, and political effectiveness set a standard that few have approached and none have surpassed. His ability to unite a fractured nation, to appeal to both idealism and pragmatism, to speak to both the heart and the mind, remains the gold standard of American political leadership. But perhaps Lincoln's most important legacy is the one he articulated in the Gettysburg Address.
The idea that America is dedicated to a proposition, that it stands for something beyond mere power or prosperity. That proposition, that all men are created equal, remains unfulfilled, remains more aspiration than reality for too many Americans. But it endures as the standard against which the nation measures itself, the promise that each generation must work to redeem. Abraham Lincoln rose from a dirt-floor cabin in the Kentucky wilderness to become president during America's greatest crisis. He saved the Union, destroyed slavery, and gave voice to the ideals that define American democracy. He was killed at the moment of his greatest triumph, struck down by an assassin's bullet before he could begin the work of healing the nation's wounds. But his words and his deeds have lived on, inspiring generations to believe that democracy can endure, that justice can prevail, that the arc of history, though long, bends toward freedom. Suspicious by the reverence with which later generations would regard him, he was, by nature, a humble man, acutely aware of his limitations and his failures. He might have pointed out that he did not end slavery alone, that thousands of enslaved people freed themselves by escaping to Union lines, that black soldiers fought and died for their own liberation, that abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass, pushed him toward emancipation when he hesitated. He might have noted that he did not save the Union single-handedly, that millions of ordinary Americans, soldiers and civilians, made sacrifices he could never repay. He would surely have insisted that the work he began remains unfinished, that each generation must rededicate itself to the proposition that all are created equal. Would also, perhaps, have taken some satisfaction in knowing that his life had mattered, that his struggles had not been in vain. He who had grown up in poverty and obscurity, who had taught himself to read and write by firelight, who had failed at business and lost elections, who had suffered the deaths of children and the torments of depression. He had lived to see slavery destroyed and the Union preserved. He had spoken words that would echo through the ages. He had shown that democracy, for all its imperfections, could survive even the most terrible test. And he had proved that one person, armed with intelligence, integrity, and unwavering commitment to principle, could change the course of history. That is the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. Not a flawless saint, but a man who rose to meet the greatest challenge of his age, who grew in wisdom and compassion as the years passed, who admitted his mistakes and learned from them, who spoke truth when truth was dangerous, and who gave his life, in the end, for the proposition that all men are created equal. His story remains, more than a century and a half after his death, a testament to what is possible when moral courage meets political genius, when the better angels of our nature triumph over fear and division. In a world still struggling with questions of democracy and equality, still torn by division and injustice, Lincoln's example endures. His words call out across the years, reminding us that government of, by, and for the people must not perish from the earth, that the unfinished work of building a just society falls to each generation, that the mystic cords of memory can still bind us together if we will but listen. That is why Abraham Lincoln's name is spoken with reverence, why his monument stands in Washington as a temple to the American ideal, why schoolchildren memorize his speeches and leaders invoke his name. Because he showed us what we might become, if only we have the courage to try. The boy from the wilderness cabin became the man who saved a nation. The self-taught lawyer became the president who freed 4 million enslaved people. The melancholy dreamer became the voice of democracy's greatest hour. Abraham Lincoln's journey from poverty to immortality is the American story writ large, a reminder that in this nation, no matter how humble one's origins, greatness is possible for those willing to work, to learn, to grow, and to fight for what is right. That promise, that possibility,
is Lincoln's gift to all who come after him. It is a legacy that will not die as long as the American experiment endures, as long as people believe that all are created equal, as long as there are those willing to stand up and say, as Lincoln did, that a house divided against itself cannot stand, and that we must choose to become all one thing, all dedicated to freedom, all committed to justice, all bound together in the work of building a more perfect union. Berlin will always continue, and Abraham Lincoln, who gave everything to advance it, would ask nothing more than that we take up the task he left unfinished and carry it forward, generation after generation, toward the horizon of a more just and equal world.